Shah, I'm going to be telling you today all about the rules and regulations for using brand ambassadors. So if you're a brand and you want to know a little bit more about what you should and shouldn't be doing when you have got brand ambassadors advertising for you on social media, listen on. So a bit about me first. I now work for #Ad Consulting. I'm the founder and the director, but my experience and the reason why I'm doing this talk is that I worked for the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK for 13 years. So lots of experience of investigating, giving advice to and imposing compliance sanctions on brands, agencies and influencers. So I know all about the rules. I helped to write them and provided guidance on them. So today, this presentation, as I mentioned, we're going to try and go through some of the rules for brand ambassadors. I'll explain a little bit about the regulators and the regulatory systems across the world. What do they do? What are those particular rules that you need to think about, especially disclosure and the use of #ad and advertising, all those little hashtags that you see. We'll talk about filters because that's important for beauty and cosmetic advertising. A little bit on competitions and giveaways. And finally, I'll take you through 5 key steps that you need to know about for compliance. And then, of course, we'll do a Q&A at the end. So first of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the UK advertising regulators. So here in the UK, we have the ASA and CAP, who are the advertising regulators. It's a self-regulatory organisation. They investigate complaints as well as providing guidance and advice on the advertising codes. So you can, as a brand or an agency, go to them for advice. A bit more complicated in the UK, we also have the CMA, and that's the Competition and Markets Authority, who also occasionally take action against brands and agencies who are using influencers for their marketing. The reason why is because not all advertising falls within the ASA's remit. Some of it on social media falls outside and the CMA need to step in. There's a similar system as we have the ASA here in the UK across most of Europe. There are lots of self-regulatory organisations across Europe, and they are kind of dealt with by an organisation called EASA, or the European Advertising Standards Alliance, who tries to make sure that all of those countries across Europe have similar rules and apply the rules in the same way. So when it comes to, for example, disclosure, there is some kind of synchronicity across all of these countries. Moving further afield, so regulation across the globe, I've given a couple of examples because we obviously don't have time to do every country, but for example, you've got the FTC in America and the ASAS in Singapore, and a similar system in Singapore to the UK. There's a self-regulatory organisation that explains exactly what the rules are for advertising and how brand ambassadors, for example, or influencers should be following those rules. So the main thing to think about if you have a brand ambassador who you're working with, whether that's a short partnership or a long-term, over a couple of years type of partnership, is disclosure and making clear that every time they're posting for your brand or there's a commercial relationship, they are making that clear in the advertising. So all the rules across the globe have rules on disclosure, and they all pretty much say the same thing, which is that an ad must be clearly identifiable as such. So if it's advertising and it's not an organic post by that influencer or brand ambassador, it should state that clearly somewhere within the post, so it should make that very clear. All of the organisations, as I've mentioned, across the globe have some kind of rule that states as much. So when do you need to put this disclosure label on? So when is a post a business post or a sponsored post, and when is it just organic advertising? Well, if we take the UK's example, we know that if an influencer receives payment or is gifted an item or service, even if there is no requirement to post, they should disclose that there is a commercial relationship there. It's pretty similar in the US, for example, and across the globe, that if you have this commercial relationship, you're paying or gifting your ambassador in some way, then those posts that they produce should be disclosed with a very clear label. Why does it matter? So why do you need to follow these rules? Well, most of the self-regulatory organisations that I've mentioned, they produce investigations and rulings which they publish on their websites usually. Doesn't seem like a completely harsh sanction, but actually what the aim is to create and generate negative publicity for the brand. This they do, as I said, by placing information about that investigation on the website and actively feeding that information to the press and to the industry. So it's picked up in newspapers and, negative publicity in magazines and trade publications, and that's what's going to hit your brand. And of course, it's not ideal for the influencer either, who would be losing followers and likes. And so it's generally a bad idea, but it's not the only thing that these regulators can do. Ultimately, there is the ability to fine or impose sanctions against brands that really do not comply. So again, this varies across the globe, and there are different systems for doing it in various countries. But at some point, generally, there is probably likely to be a sanction imposed if you are repeatedly not disclosing that, for example, this brand ambassador has been paid to produce these posts. So how do you disclose? What's the best way of making clear that your brand ambassador is aligned with you in this way and that you have this relationship and you might be paying them or gifting them? How do they make that clear? So there are a variety of labels. You've probably seen them across lots of different social media posts, from Instagram to TikTok to YouTube. Generally, there aren't a set of disclosure labels that you must use for each particular social media channel. It's the same type of label that can be used across all of them. And the ones most of the global regulators have said are acceptable are pictured here on the screen. So we're talking about things like advertisement, ad, or hashtag ads. But what you will note on the screen is that actually there are some differences. And for example, countries do prefer to have those disclosure labels usually in their own language, as you can see from France there. And a slight discrepancy between US and UK, for example, where in the UK, we don't really like sponsored as a label because it doesn't make clear the exact relationship, whereas that's acceptable in the US. So note those differences, but on safer ground is if you use a word that is the equivalent of or actually says advertisement. So you will be aware of, probably if you already do have an ambassador type program, that there are certain tools across different social media platforms that can help you facilitate clear disclosure. And for example, here we've got the Instagram's paid partnership tool on screen. That is a good way of making clear that actually there is a commercial relationship between yourself and the brand ambassador, because you will get, and you'll have noticed, the paid partnership label appear at the top if you use this tool. And there are other advantages and benefits for using the tool, which is, for example, the metrics that you can get if you use that tool. In the UK, it's acceptable to use this, and it's a good way of disclosing. I would be careful in the US, for example, though, that actually it is expected that you use an additional disclosure, such as hashtag ad or advertisement, as well as using this tool. So there should be another level of disclosure. So be aware of the rules in each country that you are promoting your products to, and each country where your influencers reside. That's really important to know. So you need to really think about who you're promoting to and where your influencers reside, and be aware of the rules in those countries. A quick bit on affiliate relationships. I want to talk about the fact that obviously this is another mechanism by which your influencers and your brand ambassadors might want to align themselves with your brand and commercialize their relationship with your brand. So one of the most useful ways at the moment, and one of the tools that influencers like to use, is the Instagram stories and the swipe up mechanism. But of course, the swipe up mechanism is a way of using an affiliate tool to gain some revenue from that commercial relationship. And because of that, this is classed as advertising. So it should always be clearly disclosed if a swipe up leads to a commercial relationship, or the influencer gaining some commercial advantage from that swipe up. And that means, of course, that using some kind of label such as hashtag ad or ad. Moving on to competitions, prize draws, giveaways, it's really important. These are really great mechanisms for promoting your brand and for the influencer to gain followers, and just to generate great publicity and positive publicity. But of course, there are some specific rules about how you promote a giveaway, not just from the platforms, but also from the code rules for each country. So you need to be aware that, for example, Instagram has its own rules, but also go to the codes for your country to see exactly what you're expected to put in, because there will be terms and conditions for that promotion. It's not going to be open for everybody in the entire world, I presume. It's not a good idea. So be aware, even if it's a simple giveaway, that the brand ambassador is including all the information they need to include. So the terms and conditions should have things like the starting date and closing date, how to enter, all of that obvious information, but sometimes it can get missed off. And that's the type of thing that could get complained about very easily. So always check first the platform rules, that you're using the branded content tools that you're supposed to be using, because the platforms do insist that you should be using their tools if they're available. Make sure the competition is clear and fair, and that there isn't anything unduly restrictive about it that people might not realise, and that you're definitely able to provide those prizes that you've said you're going to provide. And make sure that there is always a link to the full terms and conditions somewhere. Now, I know that's tricky for Instagram, but pop it into the bio. And for all the other platforms, make sure that there is a way that you can easily find the full terms and conditions. A quick chat about contracts. So, of course, all of this information about disclosure that I've talked about previously, using contracts is a good way to make sure that your brand ambassadors are understand what their obligations are, and understand how they can find further information if they need it, and also understand how they should comply. So how they should be putting these disclosures, where they need to put them. So you can use your contracts to include this kind of information and appropriate guidance for the campaign. You could obviously link to the guidance or actual advertising codes for your country. You can provide additional information, and you can choose your own disclosure if you so prefer #ad for your entire campaign. Make that clear in the contract. So let's talk about filters, as this is important, because there have been a few rulings recently from the regulators across the globe about when it's acceptable to use a filter and when it's just pushing the boundaries a little bit too far. If your brand ambassadors have a tendency to use filters, or you've asked them to use filters, for example, on Instagram, the types of things that you need to think about is, does the filter have a direct effect on the product being advertised? So that's really important. If it's just a filter that potentially changes the blue in the background of the sky to a deeper shade of blue, but you're promoting mascara, that's not necessarily going to be an issue at all. Think about whether the filter exaggerates the effects the product is capable of achieving. So this is really important. This is honing down on exactly whether or not that filter is going to change the way that product potentially looks. So again, if we take the example of a mascara, is it going to lengthen the lashes unduly? Is it going to darken them more than actually the product would normally? So if it's going to have that type of effect and the filter changes the image to that extent, then it's unlikely it's going to be acceptable within the country rules. So you would have to consider whether you actually use that filter at all, or whether it can be adjusted. The safer bet, of course, is to remove it, but understandably, you'd need to work with your influencers and ambassadors to make sure everything looks fine against their feed, for example. You really also need to think about, when using filters, as whether it's socially responsible and whether you are adjusting body images to the extent where actually it is socially irresponsible. So regulators across the globe, particularly, for example, in the UK and the US, we've had lots of rulings which are critical of irresponsible body images and irresponsible images of bodies where they've been slimmed far too much, or have been changed or altered, for example, before and after images which are completely unrealistic. So these really need to be considered. Also consider whether you are just, or the filter just looks as if it's tidying up the image, for example, removing stray hairs, which is acceptable, as is airbrushing of blemishes, which could be acceptable as well, provided, of course, it's not a product which is a foundation where that actually wouldn't have that effect, for example. So what you really need to do is to take every post or every video, if it's on YouTube or TikTok, as a whole, and have a really good look at actually what's being seen from a consumer's perspective. How will they process that post or image? And so the things that you want to think about are, for example, the age of the influencer and the audience's demographics. So don't forget, of course, that some products may not be suitable for certain ages. Be aware that, for example, the brand's name or the brand logo doesn't equal disclosure. That's not good enough to just simply feature your brand. That's not necessarily clear enough for a consumer to understand that that is a disclosure. So have a look at the text, make sure that, of course, the disclosures aren't buried or hidden, that they're very clear and upfront. And now moving on to our 5 steps for compliance. So I thought this would be helpful for you to just really think about and focus on the 5 types of key areas when you are creating a campaign that you need to really think about. So first of all, to get your house in order, really think about the fact that pre-campaign, you need to know what the rules are for all of the brand ambassadors you're working with and the countries that you are promoting to. Audit your influencers, make sure that their feeds are in line with your brand aesthetics and your brand key responsibilities and rules that you always work towards. Also ensure that ambassadors have up-to-date disclosure guidelines. As we've mentioned, a good way to do that is through your contracts. Ensure that in-platform variables such as your Instagram stories and Instagram feed are addressed and aligned. Make sure you obtain sign-off or agreement and encourage engagement or provide bespoke training with your brand ambassadors. So really make sure that you have this great relationship where they understand the rules, you understand the rules, and you're working together to make sure that you are compliant. Also make sure that throughout the campaign, so in mid-campaign, you're staying up to date with any regulatory developments, because rules can change. The regulators across the globe, FTC, UK ASA, ASAS Singapore, they regularly have these rulings that come out, and it's your responsibility as a brand to be aware of those. It might mean the difference between hashtag ads being acceptable disclosure one day and not the next. So it can be that significant. So make sure you are aware of these rulings and the investigations. And throughout the campaign, also make sure you're monitoring your brand ambassadors for compliance. It's not good enough to kind of just pass on the rules to them. You should be making sure that they're continually putting those disclosures on, using correct filters or not filters if that's your policy. Keep an eye out for things such as the placement of the disclosures, proximity, prominence, presentation, all of those. It's really important. And think about your competitions and make sure you're keeping a close check on any giveaways. Can you manage that selection process, for example? Are you able to pick, in a randomized way, the winner? There are key considerations you must think about. And finally, react quickly to any complaints. So are you able to amend any non-compliant posts if you do discover that there are posts that don't contain disclosures, or there's anything within the post that just doesn't align with your brand? You need to make sure that you have the ability to take that down if needed, or make adjustments and communicate with your brand's ambassadors and your influencers. Don't lose track of them. Make sure that you're always, able to have this dialogue going. Think about your contractual responsibilities. Are you able to terminate the arrangement if you need to? If you made that very clear within the contract. So again, going back to contract, it's really important that you have a good structure and a template in place for all of these brand ambassador contracts. And also make sure that if you do need to, and you are contacted by a regulator, that you can respond in a timely way. Because actually, for example, here in the UK, if you don't reply to the regulators within the set amount of days, it could be an automatic upheld ruling against you. And that would, it just would be such a shame if you do have the evidence, for example, to back up a claim, or you simply made a very, very small error. So always keep in touch with the regulators if they contact you, and make sure you reply in time and according to their deadlines. That's it from me. I think we're going to take some questions now, but here are my contact information if you do want to contact me with any further questions.